Hey everyone, and welcome to the Illumineer Quest podcast, where we talk everything Lorcana. I'm Zach,
And I'm Jacob.
and thanks for coming on this journey with us. So this episode is all about like the foundation of the game. You know, for the new people to Lorcana that might not know how to play. This will hopefully give you some insight into how to set up the game, like the objective of the game, like you name it. This will get you started. We're kind of TCG. Noobs. We've touched on that, but we've dove deep into the inner workings of Lorcana, and we feel like we're pretty ready to go at this point.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably one or two things that we're not like super sure about yet, but overall,
Not experts by any means.
Yeah,
but we're definitely
overall, I think
on our way.
like when new information comes out, like we're not a terrible source to learn from.
We're on our way to becoming experts,
yes,
for sure.
For sure.
So with that said, what's the objective of the game? That's the best place to start.
Yep. The objective of the game is to get the first player to get to 20 lore wins a game. That's the point of the game. And the way you do that is by getting cards that have lore on them and they quest. And the way to build out your decks to have that ability to do so is you have two inks that you choose from. There's 6 inks overall. You pick 2 of the inks, 2 of your favorite inks or ones that work together well, whatever. And then there's 60 cards in each deck. That's a minimum. You can actually have more if you want to, but not necessarily the best strategy.
So 20 lore, is the objective, and like you said, just recapping here to make sure we're all on the same page. The character cards in your deck have assigned lore values, and those characters then, depending on how they're played, and we'll talk about that in a minute, give you those lore values to add to your counter to get you closer to that goal.
Yes.
Okay, so with the setup then, you said 60 cards per deck. That's a minimum, right? You can have more if you want. I think we're still trying to decide if you want to go more. I think we've both decided on 60 is probably the safe bet to just stay at that for now. We'll see how it goes, but 60 card minimum. And then within each specific card that you have in your deck, you can have a max of 4.
Yes.
So you can have 2 different, like Aladdin's, for instance. There's, multiple cards that are named Aladdin.
There's, I'm trying to think of one. There's Hero Rogue or Heroic Rogue. I forget which one's the Ruby's one is called.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple. Yeah, so there's an Emerald Aladdin. So there's Aladdin Prince Ali. That's Emerald ink color. There's Aladdin Street Rat. That is Ruby color. And then there's also Aladdin Heroic Outlaw. And so it's not 4 Aladdins. It's 4 of each of those Aladdins if that's the route you want it to go.
Yep, and all of those cards have different stats and
Yes.
abilities and things. So they're all different.
Yeah, so setup, I think that kind of covers this. So we've kind of set the grounds on like how to get started. But when you start then, each player has their deck, they shuffle their deck, they get ready to go.
They draw 7 cards.
They draw 7 cards. So that's you start in your hand with 7 cards. On your turn, or I guess back up one quick step, the first person that goes, so to open the game, that person does not get to draw a card because they have a little bit of an advantage. They get to go first, so they have like an extra turn per se.
And they don't have set rules for how you decide who goes first. Like there's that.
But yeah, you can flip a coin.
You decide rock, paper, scissors.
Yeah, whatever you want to do. So that first person, though, does not get to draw a card to make up for getting to go first. But from that point on, you draw 1 card on your turn.
Yes.
And then during your turn, you can play as many cards as you want.
That you have ink for, which
is what I was hoping you would say. So with that said, describe ink and describe how you actually play your cards on your turn.
So when I was getting into the game, ink was probably the thing that was the most hard for me to first understand. Once I got it, I understood.
I would agree with that.
But ink is basically if you play something like Marvel Snap or anything like that, it's the energy in the game.
That's very good.
That lets you play cards.
That's a very good comparison.
So there's an interesting way to build up ink, though. It's not like you gain 1 ink to use every turn. It's you use these cards that are inkable, which there's a little emblem on the top left that tells you if you can do that or not.
tells you the cost of the card, and then there's a symbol around that cost that tells you if it can be turned into ink or
not. Yeah. And then you put that in what you call your inkwell, which is basically just telling you how much ink you have built up. And you can put one card in your inkwell per turn, and that adds, every card in your inkwell adds 1 ink for that turn or next turn to use.
So you can play as many cards as you want, but only as much ink as you have to be able to play. So if you have 3 ink in your well and a 5 cost card, you can't play that card because you don't have enough ink to play it.
Yep. Exactly.
But on the reverse side, if you have 3 1 ink cost cards, you can play all 3 of those with your 3 ink.
Yep, absolutely. And it's when you put a card in your inkwell, it's not like if that card has 5 cost ink that you added 5 ink, that counts as 1.
Good point.
That counts as 1.
So when you play that ink, you're also able to instantly use it then, correct?
Yes.
I think so an important distinction then between like the way that you play the cards and the cards themselves is how and when you can actually use them. So playing them is not necessarily like using them, but it's like putting them on the board to be able to be quested or challenged or whatever, or for an item or an action to be used against your opponent or for you.
Yes.
Correct?
Yep.
So ink you can use the turn you play it. So if I'm on my first turn and I place an ink, then I can then use a card with 1 cost.
Yep.
The distinction here is, and I kind of touched on it a second ago, is that actions and items can be played and then used right away. Mm-hmm. So I can play an action card and then use it against you that same turn.
And regular characters cannot do that.
Correct.
They have a cooldown, basically. Once you play them, you need to wait a whole turn.
The ink has to dry.
The ink has to dry. When they explained that in the rules, I love that so much.
The ink has to dry. So, again, there's always an exception to the rule. There's an ability that will
Lots
let
of rule
characters...
breakers.
Yeah,
Lots of rule breakers.
That will allow characters to go around that rule. And we can kind of touch on some of those. There's a few different distinctions within the cards that make them special. Mm-hmm. Before we get into that specifically, though, so there's 3 main types of cards. There's actions, items, and characters. So like we said, actions and items can be used right away.
Yep.
The difference between those two is items, when you play it, it's instantly used. So you play it, it's used, it's done.
And then there's specific ones that say that you have to exert it, which we'll get into to use that as well.
Yeah, but you use it then. It's
you
like
can use it immediately.
The difference between action and item is an action can be placed on the board and used at a later time. An item card has to be played and used at that point.
Are those switched around?
No, an item's used because an item is like distinguishable.
Okay.
Or like an item's a thing that you use it like
I'm learning too here.
Yeah, I mean, we're still new. If we
new.
get anything wrong, please help us out. Dinglehopper, but like a dinglehopper can for Little Mermaid fans is just a fork.
Yep.
But like a fork is the way that I thought about it is a fork is a thing that you use and then you're done with it. An action is like something that you can do today. Like if you want to go to the grocery store, you can go to the grocery store right now. You can go to the grocery store tomorrow, but you can do it whenever. So that's the way that I remembered it.
Makes it a lot easier.
And then characters obviously, which are the characters.
Focus.
Yes, and then the one kind of subclass of all of these cards.
Yes.
You know what I'm going to say, don't you?
Yes.
Well, go ahead then. I'll let
songs?
you. Yes, I'll let
so
you take.
So they're a subcategory within the action card. They're action songs, and the way this works is this goes back to what we were talking about with the ink cost and things. So it is basically an action card that you can either it could be a 5 cost song card, and you could use 5 ink to play that, or you could have a 5 ink card that costs 5. It's already in play.
Character.
Yes, character. And you can play that for free by having that is the same cost or more.
And exerting that character.
That character cannot quest, which we'll get into, or challenge or anything.
We've said that a couple times now. So what is exerting? Exerting
is basically saying that, hey, I used this. basically what it is.
It's a fancy word for used, right?
Yes.
It's the way to distinguish what cards have been used this turn and what cards have not. So it basically just keeps everything organized. And what exerting essentially is when you play your card on your mat or your table or your board, everything is played in upright position. Mm-hmm. When you use it, you turn it 90 degrees so that it's now a landscape version of the card instead of portrait.
And that shows it's exerting.
Again, it's just an organizational thing to make sure that you're not overspending the amount of ink that you have or using your character twice when you shouldn't.
And that text is used in the cards to tell you, like, hey, when you exert this does that. So it comes in handy to know what's going on. To
Jake's earlier point, there are certain items or actions that have a cost associated with them. So some you have to pay to play, some you don't. So for the super powerful ones, for instance, you might have to pay to use it and to exert it. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, then you pay the extra cost to make that action happen.
Yes. So
that kind of covers the ins and outs of the game. And so you said when we started, the objective of the game is to get to 20 lore.
Yeah,
Maybe we should elaborate on that a little bit too.
So you have two options, and we'll get into the other one later. But you can, when you have a card in play and the ink is dried, you can either challenge or quest. And quest is how you're going to win the game essentially, which is each character card has lore attached to it, and it's usually 1 to 3 lore. And when you exert it, you say you're questing it, and the value of the lore that is on that character card is added to your overall lore that you're collecting for that round. And like we said before, first to 20 lore wins the game.
Yep.
So that's the main.
I think this is a good refresher for both of us. We're on the same page thus far, which means I think we know what we're talking about.
Yes, for sure.
Well, that's a good place to start. So I as we kind of touched on earlier too, there's a few exceptions to the rule. There's always something that's going to be a rule breaker or whatever, and so you have different classifications and abilities within the character set. You have different ink types that you have to consider as well, and I think you touched on that for a second, but that's probably worth bringing back up as well. So real quick, I think the last two things that we really need to touch on, I guess, are probably the ink costs or the ink colors, and then different abilities. So explain the different ink
so there
and how that works when you're building your deck.
So the 6 inks right off the bat are Amethyst, Emerald, Ruby, Steel, Amber, Sapphire. And each one, like Pokemon, it's kind of the type.
And we went in a little bit more in depth into those on our first episode. So if you're curious about what each of those are and how they work a little bit more in depth, you can check out the first episodes. Yeah.
Each play their own role. Sorry to cut you off there.
No, but the key is that you can only play 2 at a time.
2 at a time. You pick the 2 that you like best for that deck. And you can't use one card from Ruby when you're making an Emerald Steel.
Yeah, so you can't use cards from Ruby, Emerald, Steel, Amber at the same time. You have to pick and choose so that you kind of have some focus to the deck you're building.
Exactly.
And then the last, I think, quick thing to touch on is classification and abilities. Classification is just an overall general idea of the character itself. There's a lot of them, and certain abilities or actions affect certain classifications. And so, like princesses, for instance, there might be a card that only interacts with princesses or that affects princesses differently than the rest of the cards. Or villains, for instance, there might be a card that interacts with villains differently than the rest of the cards. And so those don't necessarily directly mean anything specific aside from different distinctions with actions and abilities.
Yes.
So abilities are where it gets really interesting because those are the real rule breakers in the scenario.
Yep, definitely.
So there are currently 9 abilities.
And I'd like to get into one more thing before we get into those.
Yeah, no,
because
please do.
It builds off. But
please do.
Challenging is basically the attacking.
Yes, we talked about questing. So characters can mainly do 2 things. I guess 3 things if you want to talk about singing.
Yes,
sure. You touched on that already, but the main 2 things that characters do are quest and challenge. So, what is challenge?
Challenge is how you attack other cards in this game. That's what challenging is. It's like battle, basically. Yeah. So we talked about the ink cost on a card or character card, and the lore points on a character card. But there's 2 other stats that go into that character card as well, and that's willpower and strength. Willpower is basically your HP, and
your defense.
Yeah, and your strength is your attack.
Yeah.
And when you engage in a challenge, you basically have your card, and then you pick your opponent's card that is already exerted. Both your opponent's card that you're choosing to challenge has to be exerted.
I think that's a key distinction that we both missed, actually. That they have to be exerted. Meaning, so if I want to challenge you, I can't pick any of your cards. I have to pick one of your characters that is exerted, that is already being used. So in my turn, if I go on a quest with one of my cards, I exert or use it, and then it is open to being attacked at that point.
Yes, and so when we talked about questing earlier, you have to exert that card to quest.
For your turn and your opponent's.
Which opens it up to attack.
Correct.
If you are questing, it opens up that card to attack. And so 2 cards use their strength, their attack, at the same time. It's not like if my card is higher stats and takes out your card, you don't attack mine. They both attack simultaneously at the same time, which takes, whatever my opponent's strength is, it takes that from my overall willpower, and that could banish it, which is basically killing a card in the game.
Yeah, that's a distinction that they attack each other, which
at the same time
I don't think that's like that in other TCG games. Again,
could be wrong.
We're new to this, but from my understanding, that's usually not how it happens. Is that they are attacking each other, and so if you both have 3 strength and willpower, and you're attacking each other, then both of them are gone. Yes. But again, the point of challenging is if you have a character that is on a quest that keeps racking up the lore, you want to keep them from continuing to do that, so that inhibits your opponent from gaining more lore and winning the game.
Absolutely. Yep.
So, good sidebar, because getting into abilities that have a big impact on the way that cards challenge.
Yes, there's a few that do that for sure.
So on the first episode, we talked a little bit about a few of the abilities and ones that we particularly like. Mm-hmm. And so I have all of the cards with different abilities selected here, but if we just really quickly run through the abilities, if you want to touch on it as we go through, we can, or we can just run through them and then go back to them. But
okay.
There's Bodyguard, Challenger, Evasive, Reckless, Rush, Shift, Singer, Support, and Ward.
There's total of 9. So
yes,
it adds a lot of variation to specific cards that would normally not be that special.
Yeah, so I'll start with Bodyguard. I think this one's actually pretty cool. It could be, again, we're still learning. We don't necessarily know how all of them are going to play out yet, but Bodyguard's cool. And so what Bodyguard says is a character with the Bodyguard ability is this character may enter play exerted. So you can, when you use that, or when you play that card, it could already be exerted if you wanted it to be. Mm-hmm. And an opposing character who challenges one of your characters must challenge the Bodyguard if able. Meaning if you have 3 cards, they're all exerted, one of them is a Bodyguard, you have to take out the Bodyguard first.
It's essentially, if you play some mobile games, it's basically a taunt. It's basically what it's, you can only attack that card if able. Yeah,
so if you have a very low power, low strength card, but has a lot of other intrinsic value that you want to keep alive, you can play a Bodyguard next to it to keep that other card alive while the Bodyguard takes the brunt.
For example, if that other card that you're using has a high lore value but really low willpower, which health basically.
Yeah.
You can protect it with Bodyguard.
Yeah, for real. And then secondly, Challenger. Do you want to talk about Challenger, or do you want me to?
So Challenger is one of the more interesting abilities, I think. And basically and all of the characters that have Challenger use it differently. And so all of the Challenger cards, or most of them, start out with lower strength.
They don't have much strength themselves, but Challenger makes them very interesting.
So Challenger, like I'll bring up a Jafar Wicked Sorcerer card. So it's a 4-cost, 2 strength, 5 willpower, and it has the ability Challenger +3, which says while challenging, this character gets +3 strength. So in total, when it's challenging...
So if you're actively challenging the other character...
If another character challenges that card, it still has 2 strength.
Right.
But if you're attacking, challenging another card, it gains +3. And each card, like there's some cards that have Challenger +2, so they use it differently.
Yep. Okay. And then, so that's a cool one. I think that is a good, beneficial if used correctly. And then Evasive, we touched on the other episode as well, but just really quickly, Evasive means that cards with Evasive can only be challenged by other cards with Evasive. So it's hard to get them out if you're not ready for it.
Probably my favorite ability.
Probably my favorite ability as well. So, Reckless. What do you think about Reckless?
Reckless is something I don't plan on touching, but to go into it, this character can't quest and must challenge each turn if able. So, in every card with Reckless does not have any lore value, and it obviously cannot quest. So it wouldn't need to, but
really strong usually.
These cards have high strength.
So they punch above their weight. So like I'm looking at Gaston, Arrogant Hunter.
Mm-hmm.
Ink cost of 2, so really low entry cost to get him on the board, but a strength of 4. So he's gonna punch above his weight. So I'm kind of on your board. Or on your boat. I don't necessarily think that that's a strategy that I personally want to take,
mm-hmm.
but it could be really annoying, because if you have a Gaston with a strength of 4 and an ink cost of 2, he could probably wipe out most of your entry level cards.
If you're on like a turn 3 or 2, it could take out just about anything.
Yep, agree. Next one would be Rush. I think this one's pretty cool too. So we touched on already, the ink has to dry when you play a character, meaning they can't be exerted that turn. If you have Rush, that nullifies the ink drying and you can play the card that turn, either questing or challenging.
You can only challenge.
Oh, okay.
You can only challenge that turn.
So you can only challenge
cannot
with Rush.
Quest that turn.
So you can with Rush you can challenge right away and try to catch somebody off guard that is questing.
Just quick damage out of nowhere, basically, is what the point of Rush is.
So Shift is, I think, one of the more known abilities.
It definitely shows up in quite a few places.
And I think the easiest way, and I'm sure you'll agree with this, to explain Shift is equivalent to evolving in Pokemon.
Very similar. Very similar.
There are definitely differences, and you can talk about it real quick, but the initial idea that I had when I saw Shift was evolving, because the difference is you can play that card separately and not quote evolve it, or you can shift that card and play it on top of another card with the same name. So the Aladdin with the shift ability, you can play on top of the Aladdin that you already have on your board. So, and what benefit does that have?
So let's say you have a 2, I believe there's a 2-cost Aladdin, 2 ink Aladdin. But then there's this much better Aladdin that is 7 cost that you can use that has much better stats and has a better ability and things like that. Well, it has Shift 5, which you may pay 5 ink to play this on top of one of your characters named Aladdin. So
rather than having to pay the full 7 to get him on the board, you can shift him for
under
5
that 2-cost Aladdin you already have for 5 ink. Now, one of the interesting things about Shift is if, let's say, your 2-cost Aladdin, it has 3 strength, but it was already challenged, and now it only has 1.
Keeps the damage.
It keeps the damage onto the Aladdin that you brought onto it.
Yep. Okay, the next one is Singer. So
it goes back to the songs.
Yeah, so singer interacts with the song. So we already talked about the songs and that you can play the song as an action, just straight up, or you can sing the song from a character with the same ink cost as that song. But if you have a singer, they are usually lower cost cards that can sing higher cost value. So like I'm looking at Ariel's Spectacular Singer, and she's a 3 ink cost card, but can sing 5 ink cost songs. So again, punches above her weight.
For sure.
For singing.
And it's an interesting mechanic to use, for sure.
Yeah, so support.
Support is all around. It explains itself basically, but it's supporting your other characters, not necessarily helping itself. But so if I'll let you go into support here.
Yeah, I'm trying to find a good example on one.
They're a little more difficult.
So support. It says whenever this character quests, you may add their strength to another chosen's character on that turn. So like if I have 2 characters out and I quest with a support character, that character's strength I can transfer to another character that I want to challenge with. So if I take, like I'm looking at Chief Tui, respected leader, and he has a support and a strength of 3. So if I quest Chief Tui and give his 3 strength to somebody else that has 2, then they're going to be able to challenge with 5 strength that turn.
And that's really helpful because that card, that Chief Tui, is not challenging that turn. It's questing. So you're not using the strength at all. So you add it on to something else that can use it.
So you're questing and getting a better challenge out of one card.
Yes.
And then the last is Ward. And it's pretty straightforward. Opponents can't choose this character except to challenge. So
there's specific cards that works against. Like there's certain cards that say, attack. Like there's an action card that attack, deal 2 damage to this card, and you cannot choose a ward card.
Banish chosen character.
Yes, and that does not happen. You can't choose ward cards.
Yeah. So if on the first episode we talked about Tinkerbell, Giant Fairy, and the ability that she has is during your turn, whenever this character banishes another character in a challenge, you may deal 2 damage to chosen opposing character. If the only opposing character to choose is Ward, then that's nullified and you can't use it because you can't choose that Ward character.
Yes, and like we said before, you still can challenge it. You can go and attack it.
You can try to banish them, but you can't indirectly deal damage or banish. You have to do it directly in the challenge. Yep. Well, that's all. Is there any other like tidbits about the playing of the game that needs to be said? That we got a little in depth there. I think that was a little more in depth than we maybe initially planned on, but
so there is one thing that I haven't gotten into a bunch, but there's some other places that are focusing on it a lot. But this game is actually multiplayer, and not to where
that is a good point. We should talk about
not to a point to where it's 1-on-1. That might be considered multiplayer in some areas, but you can have, I think it's up to 4.
Yeah, you can play as a group. Meaning, and there are cards that say deal damage to every opponent.
Yes.
So
they work well with that.
Yeah. So that you're going in a multiplayer setting, meaning, you versus 2 or 3 others. And it's different because in other card games, it's you lose your cards or all your cards are defeated, and so the opponent wins. And so it's very much a head-to-head battle. But since this is questing for lore, like everybody can be questing for lore at the same time.
Yes, and it adds a lot more strategy if you're playing multiplayer. Like,
yeah.
Who do I?
Oh, for sure.
Who do I challenge? Like, do I quest now? Because and all of these other things can. That card exerted to quest, then there's 3 opponents that can attack.
Hopefully, we can get family members to play this with us, so we can get some intense.
Hopefully.
4 people battles.
And who knows? At our local gaming store, they might host a few tournaments that are multiplayer.
Yeah, we'll see. I think that we went in pretty in depth on some of those abilities and stuff, but the only other thing that we didn't talk about, and it's more just the mantra of the game, but it helps you keep everything organized. You know what I'm going to say? Ready, set, draw. We didn't talk about
Ready, Set, Draw. Okay, that's really...
But it's basically what Ready, Set, Draw is, really quick, is when it's your turn, you ready up your cards. So any of the cards that were exerted in your previous turn,
Or now ready
or
to go.
used, you can turn them back to portrait mode. They're ready to be used again.
Mm-hmm.
So ready the cards up. Set your ink, your place, everything. Make sure like all of your cards on your board and your hand and everything is ready to go. I mean, essentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then draw is every turn you get to draw one card. So then you draw your card and you essentially like truly start your turn at that point.
Yes, then you can decide what you're going to do strategy-wise.
Yeah, so quest, challenge, play an action item, play what cards you want to play, how much ink you want to use, so forth and so forth.
And ready set draw is just to get to that point, and yeah.
Okay. I think that covers it. Like I said, we went a little more in depth with the abilities and some of the stuff there, but I think that's important. You know, if you're getting into this, it's important to consider. You know, you don't necessarily have to go out and become an expert on day one, but understanding some of those things is going to help you have a little bit more fun on that first time you play. Because if you're playing an evasive person and you can't attack their characters and you don't have any way to deal with that, probably not going to be a fun time.
No, not at all.
So at least being aware of those abilities and understanding that you need to account for them and learn them more as you go will help you have a better time, I think.
Absolutely. I think we did a good job.
Well, we aren't experts and we never claim to be. You'll hear us say that a bunch, I assume.
No.
So if there's anything that anybody wants to add, obviously please feel free. You can find us on Twitter at Lorcana Pod. You can find us on YouTube where we post all of these podcasts as well, at Illumineer Quest. And then if you have any questions or want to add anything or have any comments, concerns, ideas, you can also constructive criticism, ideas, whatever, you can email us as well at lorcanapod@gmail.com.
I'm excited for that. I'm excited to get feedback.
Yeah, we want to do better. If there's any content suggestions, if there's any episode suggestions, if there's anything you'd like us to do differently, please let us know and we'll work it in.
All right. Thank you guys for listening.
Thanks everyone. Have a good one.